Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is David Gellis. I'm a business reporter here at the New York Times and the corner office columnist. Today, we're glad to welcome Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. A quick housekeeping note, you can submit questions directly to Lonnie at any time during this event using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll get to them in a little bit. And please also note this is being recorded and this is an audio-only event. Lonnie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Glad to be with you.
Well, let's start by talking about the impact the coronavirus pandemic has had on the Smithsonian and its many museums. Where is the Smithsonian when it comes to reopening as it stands today?
Well, I think that we closed in March and we realized that, first of all, while the buildings closed, that we needed to continue to get our content out, get our education out. And so we really went completely sort of digital. But we also know it's very important to think about reopening. So what we did is we looked at what are all the triggers for reopening? What's the scientific data that would guide us? And what does it mean to reopen in an era of pandemic? So we are looking to open, sometime in a phased way. Realize, though, is even if we reopen, we have to begin to think very differently. We have to begin to ask ourselves the question is, what is the new normal for museums? And so in a way, while we're focused on what is the phase reopening, we're also focused on what does it really mean to be a museum today? And also how do we use this moment of a pandemic to make sure we change the institution so that it better serves the 21st century audience.
Good. Well, and apologies for any technical difficulties. I just lost sound, but I think we hopefully are all here together. Lonnie, just a quick check. Do we have you with us?
I'm there. Yep.
Okay, good. And I think we understood that you pivoted digital. You're thinking diligently about what it looks like to reopen. And I wonder if we could be a bit more specific. I mean, when I think of summer in Washington, D.C., people strolling the mall and going from the Air and Space Museum to the Museum of American History and the other institutions is about as American as apple pie, and yet crowds are a part of that scene. And especially when you think about being in the galleries, it's just a part of the museum going experience, as I've always known it, that those galleries are often quite crowded. So what are you thinking about making museums safer in the era of a pandemic? Are you going to have limits on visitors? Are there going to be timed entry and reservations? Is there going to be new protocols on social distancing? How is it going to change?
Well, I think you put your finger on all aspects of this. I think that the reality is that this is not business as usual. And when you think about museums, in some ways, one of the great strengths of museums is they bring people together who don't know each other to look at an artifact or explore an exhibition or to go to a public program. Well, all that gets called into question in this era. So what we have to do is think about, first of all, what's the best way to give the visitor the safety and comfort they need? So what it means for us is that, first of all, we will have to do something like time passes. We pioneered that with the African American Museum when that museum opened, and we have to do that so that will allow us to social distance more, to be able to control the numbers of people. Because the one thing we don't want is we don't want crowds of people standing outside waiting to get in. That's a petri dish waiting for a recipe for disaster. But also what it means is we're going to think carefully about how do we social distance within the museum? What are the staff that are needed to help enforce social distancing? We're going to expect everybody to wear masks. We are going to have cleaning protocols that mean some of the things that people love to do, touching screens, for example, might not be things we do for the immediate future. So in some ways, this is an opportunity for us to think about how do we make sure that while we're going to bring people back into the museums, that we recognize that this is a moment when more Americans are comfortable receiving content digitally than ever before. So it really is going to push us to continue to expand our digital outreach at all as well. So we hope that we're going to be able to serve large numbers of people, some who will come into the museums, others who will receive the benefit of our wonders, of our expertise via digital.
Okay, well, I'm sure everyone can't wait to get back. Lonnie, so much is happening right now in American history, and it raises for me this question of how an institution like the Smithsonian grapples with and confronts and reckons with our history in something close to real time. I mean, just this year, this calendar year, we've had an impeachment, regardless of your politics, that happened. The pandemic, this national reckoning on race, which is underway and which we'll talk about in more detail soon. And we've still got a presidential election coming up. And I wonder, how do you think that institutions like the National Museum of American History and the National Museum of African American History and Culture need to go about presenting, contextualizing, and engaging with history in the moment? Or maybe not. Should they wait until the events are squarely in the past to confront them? Or is there a need for institutions like your own to engage with these issues in something closer to real time?
I think it's crucially important for museums to recognize they have to be of value in traditional ways, great exhibitions, wonderful educational programs, but in non-traditional ways. In other words, how do cultural institutions help the public get the tools they need to live their lives, to grapple with the challenges they face today? So for me, cultural institutions, regardless of the subject matter, have to be as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday. And that really means that we have to recognize that one of the jobs of cultural institutions is to collect today for tomorrow. You may use this material today, but you may not. All I know is that throughout my career, there were many moments that I wanted to explore questions, often questions of race, and there weren't any collections to help me tell those stories. So part of what we've done is we've looked throughout the institution and brought together groups of curators and educators to do what we call a kind of rapid response collecting. We have people out collecting during the different protests. We have people around the country sending us the videos that they shoot on their cameras so that we understand the sense of protest. We're interviewing people so that we want to make sure that, one, we've got the information, but then two, we recognize that collecting isn't enough. So we've created a major initiative that looks at race, community, and our shared future that was, greatly supported by Bank of America. But it's an opportunity for the Smithsonian to say, how do we help stimulate local conversations around race? How do we bring our expertise? How do we bring the expertise of scholars and smart thinkers around the country to this question? So we look at this as a long-term commitment to helping Americans using our expertise, our collections, our convening power to be able to help them grapple with the challenge of race and especially the challenge of the African American community at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So just a reminder, folks, this is David Gellis of the New York Times. We're speaking live with Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask him questions, and we'll get to those in a little bit. You just mentioned there this moment we're in and this national conversation about race and racism and the legacy of slavery. Many people say that this moment feels different, that it feels like there's the potential, the opportunity for change in a way other moments like this perhaps haven't captured. And I just ask you, as a Black man yourself, who is not only a student of history, but a steward of history through your work at the African American Museum, does it feel different to you? And if so, what will really determine whether this moment is, as it were, different?
Well, I think that as a student of African American history, and clearly as a Black man in America, I am hopeful, but not always optimistic. I'm hopeful because using history, I look and I see, look how often African Americans believed in an America that didn't believe in them. How often they dreamed a world that wasn't there yet, and then worked strategically with allies to make that happen. Who would have believed in 1820 that there would be no slavery? Who would have believed in 1920 that there would be no legal segregation? And so in a way, the opportunity to believe that change is possible is part of what is embedded in African American history. But on the other hand, we also recognize the limits of that change. And on the surface, this is a different moment. I am taken by the diversity of people that are in the streets. I'm taken by the number of people throughout Europe who are saying, this is a moment where Black lives matter. This is a moment of transformation. I'm taken by the fact that you begin to see, not all, but some police chiefs and some police officers recognizing that that institution has to change because it has reflected a kind of systematic racism where the police are considered not the friends of a community, but an enemy of the community. So in some ways, you see things that suggest this might be a moment. You look at this in the way that many people are asking corporate communities, corporate leaders, what can I do? And what's different about today is that in the 1960s, when corporations said, okay, let me contribute to the civil rights movement, they didn't have a diverse staff that was demanding not only that there was change in the company, but change outside of the company. So all of that suggests that this may be, just may be, a time of transformation. What I worry about is much like in the late 1960s, as we saw the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, and we saw people coming together to change America, what we also saw was a law and order backlash. We saw people turning their attention away from finding fairness, from dealing with racial justice, to trying to bring law and order, to control what they thought was an out of control community. And that led to mass incarceration. That led to people turning their attention away from what was the major point of the day. So I do worry a little bit that this could turn into that as well. But I am hopeful because this does seem to be a moment that people are recognizing that maybe this is the time to understand our history and to understand that history as a way to help us change today.
Well, and that's exactly what I wanted to talk about next is the importance of understanding our history. But I think we also need to acknowledge an aversion by many people to confronting our history with real honesty. In your memoir, you recalled the episode when President Trump and Secretary Carson, along with others, visited the National Museum of American History and Culture. And you shared this detail that the president didn't want to see anything, quote unquote, difficult. And I feel like we don't need to relitigate that experience, but I do feel like that sort of a story is emblematic of this broader tendency in American culture, where many people, again, simply don't want to confront the reality of some of the things that have happened and some of the legacies that this country and the Black community are still dealing with. And so the question I want to hear the answer to from you is, how do we get people to engage with these difficult chapters in our history, especially when the reality, again, is that these chapters are not entirely over, that the legacy of some of these incidents, these moments, these systems are still very much with us today. How do we get people to engage with the hardest stuff that there is?
Well, I think first of all, you've really put your finger on an issue, which is that Americans in some ways want to romanticize history, right? That they want a selective history. And what this moment teaches us more than anything else is this is a moment when you need to, as the great John Hope Franklin used to say, to use African-American history as a great corrective, to help people understand the fullness, the complexity, the nuance of their history. And I know that's hard. I remember receiving a letter once that somebody said, don't you understand that America's greatest strength is its ability to forget? And there's something powerful about that. But for me, I think the challenge is that people are now thirsty to understand history. I hear people all the time saying, I didn't know about Juneteenth. Help me understand about the Tulsa riots. And so I think this is an opportunity for historians, for cultural institutions, for the media, for the movie industry, to really get out the kind of information that would help people understand complexity and nuance. Because I think the great challenge of America and the great strength of using history is that often what history teaches us is to embrace ambiguity, to understand there aren't simple answers to complex questions. And Americans tend to like simple answers to complex questions. So the challenge is to use history to help the public feel comfortable with nuance and complexity. That's not easy, but at a time like this, many people are looking for answers. Part of that answer is understanding the past, understanding that the past is not over, as you said, that it's shaping so many of the issues we grapple with this very day.
Yeah, and this is, of course, playing out right now in real time with the nationwide debate around what to do with some of the statues and monuments that have been deemed to be racist or celebrating racist figures, and the calls for many of them to come down. And can you talk to us, how do you think through an issue like this? Because I in New York City just walked past the Natural History Museum, and the statue outside of President Roosevelt with a Black man and a Native American on either side of him as he sits atop a horse. And that's a narrative sculpture, and at the same time, it's easy to understand why there are calls to bring it down. And yet that is an iconic piece of artwork that has been there for generations. How do we think about what is appropriate and what the right way to approach each of these individual cases is?
I mean, I think the notion of simply pulling down statues means that you're not really bringing historical insight. You're not really bringing complexity. I mean, one of the things I like about what the American Museum of Natural History did is that while the statue may go, what they've done is made sure that inside there is a video that talks about the complexity of Roosevelt, complexity of the statue, because what you're really trying to do are use these statues as teachable moments, as moments to understand what these statues symbolize. Because for me, the question really is, should we not, as a nation, feel comfortable pruning of statues? Some of these need to go, but I think that others need to be taken into a park, into a museum, into a warehouse, and interpreted for people because they're part of our history. I'm always struck that when I look at Confederate monuments, for me, those monuments were much less about the Confederacy and much more about late 19th and 20th century notions of white supremacy. So every time I saw those statues, I didn't see history. I saw the fact that the North won the war, but they lost the peace. So for me, this is really an opportunity to bring historical insight, to use these as a way to debate and expand our understanding, to find complexity and nuance, but also to recognize that there's a need to put new statues up, new things to remember, and to recognize that these shouldn't be permanent. They should always change as a society changes. And what I think more than anything else that's crucially important about this is that removing statues is not about erasing history. Removing statues in many ways is about finding a more accurate history, a history that is more in keeping with the best scholarship that we have out there. So for me, it is about making sure we don't forget what those statues symbolize. It's about pruning them, removing some, contextualizing others, and recognizing that there is nothing wrong with a country recognizing that its identity is evolving over time. And as its identity evolves, so does what it remembers, so does what it celebrates.
And is the same true, does the same logic apply when you think about named schools, named institutions, named wings of museums? Just this week, Princeton announced that it would be removing Woodrow Wilson's name from the School of Public Affairs. And of course, we've seen this at museums too, with even before this moment, calls over the last several years from activists who have called for it and sometimes achieved the removal of named wings of museums when they find the families who donated, politically unacceptable or their businesses practices unacceptable. Does the same logic apply there, or does it get a little more complicated when some of those gifts have been made perhaps more recently and some of those donors are still very much involved in these institutions?
Well, it's always complicated. I think the reality is what cultural institutions recognize is that they've got to do a much better job of understanding who the donors are, because there's always going to be the need for the donors. I think cultural institutions are also saying that maybe we're entering into agreements that have a duration rather than in perpetuity. It might be 20 years. So that therefore people can revise and edit as they move forward. I think it's important to recognize that it doesn't hurt cultural institutions to come to grips with their own past. And if by changing a name, it helps them come to grips with their past and helps the public to understand in a more nuanced way, then I'm all for it. I think that there are challenges, there are legal challenges, there are professional challenges, but I think that it's important to me that whether or not you remove a name, but that you actually help people understand what that name symbolizes. For Woodrow Wilson, I think that there's no doubt that Wilson plays an important role as a president, as somebody raising international issues, but he's also somebody that resegregated the federal government. And I think that people need to understand that and understand how issues of race has shaped his presidency, in fact, almost every presidency. So I'm a big believer in let's get a little more complexity and understanding, and let's make some of those changes. If we do it based on reason and reflection and not willy-nilly.
Okay. At the Smithsonian and your many institutions, how are you dealing with this yourself? Are there any statues or named institutions or wings in the Smithsonian that you are having to have these same conversations about that perhaps you're considering taking down or renaming?
What I feel is that the Smithsonian, like any cultural institution, has its own challenges over issues of race and memory. And so we want to look and make sure that we are understanding what we're saying by the symbols of the Smithsonian, by the collections, and by the staff. So I think there's nothing wrong with having, as part of our desire to help a country find understanding, healing, and maybe a little hope, we also want to look inside and make sure that we're grappling with this. So for example, one of the things that would be interesting to me at the Smithsonian is to do a major look at how the Smithsonian has both interpreted race, collected race throughout its history, but also how has it treated people of color throughout its history. So I think that having a conversation, maybe a publication around that is a good thing. And that's one of the things I'm going to push the Smithsonian to do.
Glad to hear it. Just earlier, you said that it's appropriate, you believe, for some of these statues and monuments to perhaps come down and for them to be replaced. And it begs the question: what should they be replaced with? How does one go about filling the space, the voids left by the removal of some of these statues and monuments?
Well, the simple answer is so much of our history isn't memorialized in that way. How many statues around this country deal with women? And how many statues deal with African-American women who have played profound roles in changing this country? So I think that there's always room to add sort of statues, and there are always rooms to remember people that have changed the country in profound and important ways who often get left out. So I think that it's really about how does a city, how does a community bring together scholars and researchers and educators to think about what are the symbols that mean so much to a nation today, and recognize that those symbols may change in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, as I passed the Museum of Natural History in New York, as you know, just a block away, is the New York Historical Society, and outside is a statue of Frederick Douglass. And I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps that statue or others like it might find new, more prominent homes in the weeks and months to come. We've got a ton of audience questions coming in, but I do just want to return to this broader issue of the role of the museum in society. And I think I know the answer to the question I'm about to ask, but I'd like you to expand on it anyway. And it's this question of really the role of museums in society. I think for many years, generations even, there was a view that museums were something akin to sort of temples, places where artifacts could be collected and preserved and perhaps interpreted in a scholarly way. And that was sort of about it. And that, of course, has changed over the last many years, but especially in the last decade or two. A new school would argue that that museums are really a place for public gathering, for a dialogue between the public, and that it is appropriate for museums to really engage in the issues of the day and perhaps even take a perspective, perhaps with a point of view. Where do you fall on that, and sort of how far down the spectrum of taking a position and almost being activists on certain issues do you believe is appropriate for museums?
Well, I believe very strongly that museums have a social role to play, a social justice role to play, that museums have an opportunity to not become community centers, but to be at the center of their community, to help the community grapple with the challenges they face, to use history, to use science, to use education, to give the public tools to grapple with this. I have to be honest, even right now, there's a big debate among museums globally about what is the definition of museums. There are many countries in the world who want museums to be those collections.
Lonnie, you cut out there for just a sec. Could you repeat the answer to that question?
Well, I think that, there has been a debate globally about what's the role of museums. And I think that the role of museums is really something that's more akin to a social justice, that its job is to help the community that it services understand itself, find the tools it needs to live its life in an effective way. And I really believe quite strongly that museums always take a point of view by what they choose to exhibit, what they decide not to exhibit. I'm not expecting museums to be partisan politics. What I'm expecting museums to be is to be driven by a tension between scholarship and the community. That I want museums to be a place that gives the public not just what it wants, but what it needs. And if that means that museums have to take a little more risk, if museums have to recognize that they've got to do a better job of explaining to government officials, funders, why they do the work they do, then so be it. I would rather museums be a place that takes a little risk to make a country better than to be a place where history and science goes to die.
Thank you for that. This is David Geddes with the New York Times. We're speaking with Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch, and we're going to start taking audience questions. A reminder, it's not too late to add your question to the mix. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom. Lonnie, the first question comes from a listener named Angie, and I think it gets right at the heart of a question of something you said earlier, where you said the Smithsonian itself has to do some work. Now, she doesn't identify herself as a Smithsonian employee. There's no reason to think that she is, but I believe she's museum staff. And Angie asks, how should BIPOC staff at museums navigate this dynamic of wanting our voices to be heard in this moment, while also not having all the labor burden placed on us to do the work? And I'm sure this is something you've thought about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion is that it's crucially important to recognize that this issue, let's say issues of African American and social justice, is an issue that for all who work in museums, not just people of color. And so the challenge has always been throughout my career that you carry a double burden, right? That you want to do the best as a scholar, as a curator, but you also recognize that you're carrying the weight of a community. And so my hope is that we can create, we as a museum profession can create the kinds of structures and the kind of conversations that recognize that everybody who works in cultural institutions is responsible for this moment. And that we need to create the opportunities so that people feel they're being heard. And that is, in some ways, the whole point of my career, is to make sure that people who have been left out of the narrative are now seen, both in terms of the museums and in terms of who works there. And I think there's a lot more work to do, but I think this is a moment that can also illuminate all the dark corners of a.
Well, thank you for that. I do have to ask, this is just building on Angie's question. We have seen in companies, organizations, newsrooms around the country in the last several weeks and months, a newfound willingness, I would argue, by Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and especially younger people as well, to speak up and challenge existing norms about how their organizations, how their companies do their work, do the business, present the news. And I wonder, is this something you are encountering at the Smithsonian itself? Is there a newfound voice among any of your staff members who are engaging in an internal dialogue about the work you do yourselves in a new way right now?
Oh, I think there's absolutely that discussion, and I applaud that. I think it's important to remember that there have been people in cultural institutions for at least the last two decades that have fought to get these voices heard. And now I think you see more people at variety of levels in institutions saying, what we do needs to be better, what we do needs to be fairer, what we do needs to ensure that all voices are heard. And obviously that's the challenge. But for me, that's really the reason I got into this profession. It's always interesting to me that I always thought of myself as the quintessential outsider, banging on the door saying, let me in. And I guess now I'm the insider, and I'm going to make sure that those that are banging are heard.
Okay, well said. We have a question from Gina, who asks about the role of smaller museums around the country. And listen, the Smithsonian, of course, is a national institution, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But smaller museums, I believe, face some pretty serious risks, especially with the funding environment and how that's all changed. So Gina asks, how should smaller museums re-engage their communities and get them invested in the mission of those museums? The effects, as she says, over the last few months on smaller regional museums is going to be profound.
I think the impact of this moment economically is going to be profound on all museums, and small museums are going to carry even more of the burden. I think what it really means is, first of all, that museums, regardless of size, have to demonstrate their value, demonstrate that their ideas, that their work matters to their community, however they define their community. And then it's crucial for these institutions to think about, how do we partner and collaborate in different ways? How do we do the kind of work that allows us to get the resources that we need, by recognizing that no museum, no matter how big or how small, has big enough shoulders to do it all. But if we can think about the kind of collaboration that we can do with the school systems, collaboration with local corporate communities, it'll give museums resources. It'll also allow museums to shape and have influence in areas that sometimes they have not. I think this is really one of the great challenges for museums today, to figure out, how do you survive in this moment of economic crisis and global pandemic? One of the ways you survive is to demonstrate in clear and profound ways your value.
And building on that, Christine, another listener, asks, so if the role of the museum, the modern museum, is greater education and understanding of culture and history, and perhaps the prompting of real action by citizens, how will you, Lonnie, measure the success of the Smithsonian, she says, in the next 5 years? How do you measure the success of an institution like the Smithsonian?
Well, I measure the success at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. How a museum that people thought was just looking at one culture becomes a museum that allows Americans to understand their history through the lens of African American culture. I look at success at the number of people, the number of diverse people who go to that institution. I look at success in terms of the number of people who draw from the educational resources of the Smithsonian. One of the things that's been clear during the time the buildings closed is that all of our digital assets have really been used effectively, especially our educational material. Success for me is also how the Smithsonian uses its science. We've got amazing scientists who understand the transmission of animal viruses into human viruses, who help us understand what a black hole is. So what we want to do, success is to making sure that the Smithsonian content, the Smithsonian expertise is shared broadly and really has an impact on the way a country thinks about itself.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about who's doing that work, we have a couple questions from listeners who are probing this question of diversity among the museum profession, and inevitably the results of what some would describe as a lack of sufficient racial diversity among museum professionals on what is ultimately displayed. So Gabriella first asks, who becomes the arbiter of what is appropriate to display in a museum? And I mean, the easy answer is the curators do. But then she asked the real question is, how do they decide what is appropriate to display or not? How are they making those decisions about how to present history?
Well, I think first of all, it's crucially important to recognize that in museums, you need to have people who care about a variety of subjects in positions of influence, like curatorial positions. And it's the curator that often carries the great weight that ensures that the questions that you want the public to explore are done. And that means that it's crucially important to have a diversity, not just of race or ethnicity, but of ideas, to be able to sort of make sure the cultural institution is grappling with interesting questions that help the public. But I want to be candid. 20 years ago, I wrote an article about the lack of diversity in museums. And there is much more diversity than ever before, but it's still so lagging behind many aspects of corporate America, for example, which I never thought I'd say. And so I think the challenge is for museums to live up to what they say they are, which are places that should model and reflect the best of what they expect from other Americans. So I think museums have their own crisis with diversity. And then it's crucially important that leadership also shape to make sure that what the products are done really reflect some of the questions that aren't being addressed. My hope is that what you create in museums are new generations of scholars in museums and educators who will change the profession, but you're also going to then create new generations of activists, of consumers who understand the role of culture, who see cultural institutions as part of the tools to help a country be made better.
You mentioned the role that digital exhibits, your digital assets play, especially at a moment like this. And Kate then asks a question about how you balance that with accessibility. As museums put an emphasis on digital programs at this time, how do you balance digital engagement with accessibility? And accessibility can be defined broadly. That could be for people with traditional disabilities, but also for people who perhaps don't have access to high quality internet and computers.
I think that's a really important issue. I think part of it is recognizing from the very beginning, as you think about the fact that so many more Americans are comfortable receiving their content digitally, how do you make sure by doing that you're not cutting out significant segments of our communities? And part of that is to make sure that you're doing things that are driven by the digital world, but also you're doing some things that allow the communities that don't have digital access to participate. For example, one of the things the Smithsonian's about to do is to sort of launch summer materials that are going to be published in USA Today so that can reach out to people who may not have access, who are part of the digital divide. I think it's crucially important to also recognize that accessibility has to be seen as important as every aspect of a museum, as important as building the collections, doing the exhibitions, that accessibility, which means that the wonders of a place like the Smithsonian are available to all. That is one of the things we have to think about. So for example, one of the ways that museums have been more accessible has been utilizing technologies, touch screens and the like. And so the question is, how do those things survive when there's such a fear of the virus? So what we have to make sure is, as museums adjust to the pandemic, that adjustment doesn't leave out the very people they're just beginning to effectively serve.
Well, we have so many more questions, and I think we unfortunately have time for only a couple more. And this one, I wonder if you'd take us back to your work on the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this is a really quite nuanced question from a listener named Alan. And he recognizes all that was accomplished with the creation of that museum and its place on the mall. But he also essentially asks whether something is not lost, or how you made sure that the African-American story was still told in a totally fulsome and integral way in the nearby Museum of American History. And it gets to this question of whether isolating it in some way amplifies it, which of course it does in some ways, but if there's not also a risk of it somehow being relegated or put to the side. How did you wrestle with that?
I'll tell you really clearly. First of all, the notion was never was this to be a museum by and for the African-American community only. That it really did what I think was most revolutionary is, first of all, it said, we are telling the American story through an African-American lens, which basically argues that the African-American experience is the quintessential American experience, not just the experience for one community. But then the other thing we realized is that the Smithsonian has to be a place where African-American culture is in the Museum of American History or the Smithsonian American Art Museum or in the Hirshhorn Gallery. So we decided never to take collections from other museums, that we wanted to make sure the richness of African-American culture that's at the Portrait Gallery stayed there. And then we realized that the Smithsonian is this has this amazing opportunity. It has gotten so many different portals into what it means to be an American. You can go through the American History Museum to understand that question. You could look at the Air and Space Museum and look at sort of technological advancement in aviation as a way to understand what it means to be an American. You can go to the African American Museum. So in some ways, the Smithsonian has an opportunity in some ways like Civil War battlefields. Each Civil War battlefield has its unique characteristic, but they're all about the Civil War. They're all about one broader subject. And so for me, the goal was never to marginalize, to use separation to amplify, but to say that this is the story of us all, not one community.
Thank you for that very clear answer. Well, Lonnie, we are out of time, and it is a holiday weekend coming up right now, the 4th of July, and no one on this call can spend their time going to the museum. Much as we would like to, no one's going to be at Air and Space, no one's going to be at the African American Museum or NMAI or any of the other institutions on the mall. And so I would ask, what would you have us do? In lieu of going to museums, to the readers, to the listeners, how do we engage with our American history in this week when we can't go to the museums?
Well, I think one is the digital content that's out there in so many other museums around the country really helps you begin to understand the ambiguity of the past. And I wish that if people could take one thing from history, is understanding that ambiguity, that complexity. And the other thing is, as my mother, the educator, always said, when all else fails, read a good book.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Secretary Lonnie Bunch.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
And thank you to everyone who joined us and listened in on today's call. To find out more about our full slate of digital events, including the next installment of Corner Office Live, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. Next week at this same time, 2:30 Eastern, on Tuesday, July 7th, I'll be joined by Matt Mullenweg, the founder and CEO of Automatic, to discuss the remote work and the future of the office. And please subscribe to the New York Times. It's the support of listeners and readers like you that makes our reporting possible. Look forward to being with you again soon, and thank you again.